If it's quick transportation you want to grab, then there is always a checker cab. From the 1920s until the 1980s, checker cabs were a common sight in many American cities. Bright yellow with their classic checkered stripes, they were the first choice among taxi operators in need of durable and practical transportation. Welcome everyone to episode 67 of the Automotive History series, where we wait at a taxi stand and take a ride through the history of the checker cabs. The origins of checker is a bit vague. It consists of mergers of various companies in the early 20th century, with the many taxi wars as a backdrop. You really have to dig deep into the world of the taxi business and its many rules and regulations in order to understand what's going on. The company that we now know as Checker was formed in 1922 after the merger of two small-time car companies and was named the Checkered Cab Manufacturing Company. A company established specifically for the production of taxi cabs and really nothing else. This might seem unusual. Why not sell cars as regular passenger cars as well? But this approach wasn't all too uncommon. There were more companies out there that strictly built taxi cabs. You have to remember that in the 1920s, many American families already owned a car, but not everyone was so fortunate, and the taxi business was a strong market in major cities. To make it all even more confusing, the company I just talked about is Checker as a car maker, which sold their cars to various taxi operators in major cities, including an operator that happened to have the same name, Checkered Taxi. Initially, these two companies shared the same name but were otherwise separate entities. One was a car maker and the other one a taxi operator, but eventually in the 1930s, Checkered Taxi was bought out by the Checkered Cab Manufacturing Company, and were still separate entities but now under one roof. So now it was a classic case of we, the proud people of Checkered Cab Manufacturing Company, strongly recommend Checker cabs as your next vehicle at Checkered Taxi. And we, the proud drivers of Checkered Taxi, consider cars made by the Checkered Cab Manufacturing Company as our number one choice when it comes to comfortable and reliable traveling. The marketing and promotion essentially writes itself. Checker was its own buyer and supplier. And so you might think, is this fair? Is this legal? And you'd be right. After all, this seems like some top-notch conflict of interest. Checker came more than once under scrutiny by various institutions, but was never fully accused. The defense was that indeed Checker cabs were a natural first choice for many operators considering the quality of their cars. And let's talk about these cars. The first Checker cars were pretty much interchangeable with all the other 1920s cars out there, but by the 1930s, Checker started to get its own unique and signature styling. Styling such as this helps to recognize it from a mile away, just what you need for a taxi. Especially the redesign for the Checker Model A from 1939 is pure Art Deco on wheels. Wait, is it Art Deco or more like medieval Tudor style? The headlights are placed in an unusual chrome trim piece shaped like a medieval shield. The rest of the greenhouse looks very contemporary and aerodynamic, and on the rear we find another one of those checkered tricks, a landaulet style roof. The last part of the roof over the rearmost passengers could be opened electronically, kind of like a sunroof, to give the passengers some sunshine or a very good look at the city that we're traveling through. Much like the entire industry, Checker also had to completely stop making cars and switch to join the war effort. But by the end of the war, Checker noticed that the demand for taxis and cars might be huge as soon as the war ends, and decided to spend some of its time developing new radical ideas for a taxi of the future. And I am deeply impressed that such a relatively small company really tried to think outside the box when it comes to efficient space utilization and design. This prototype here is called the Model B, and although it was abandoned, a similar shape was later used by Fiat for their Multipla. And one could argue if this concept isn't one of the very first forward control minivans, some 40 years before minivans actually became a thing. Anyway, Checker also tinkered around with a compact car that had a front-wheel drive design where everything was neatly packed on top of the front axle, so that the rest of the car could be used for maximum passenger and cargo space. But this was also abandoned. After the war, by the late 40s, Checker returned to the taxi market with the A2 model, a car with a conventional layout and pretty generic late 40s American car design, somewhat of a mix between a Dodge and a Cadillac. This design would be updated here and there, but by the mid-50s the exterior styling was hopelessly outdated compared to all the other cars out there. And New York City was also changing their taxi regulations, forcing Checker to update their design. By 1956, Checker released the A8, a successor of the previous series. The body was entirely new and featured a contemporary styling, albeit very generic and straightforward. Almost dull. If you wanted to show a picture of a car in, let's say, a magazine, and you wanted it to be royalty-free and generic as possible, take a Checker A8. For reference, the closest the car looks like would be something like a 1954 Ford or Hudson, but the car was taller and more boxy, once again showing Checker was all about space utilization and not the latest and greatest of exterior styling trends that mostly dictates interior dimensions. So, form follows function. By the late 1950s, Checker figured out that their core business is a risky one. The only market they relied on was the taxi market, and although it brought in some much needed cash, if, for whatever reason, city governments decided to change the taxi rules and no longer allow taxi companies to use a certain brand or ban vehicles with certain dimensions or configurations, this could put Checker instantly out of business. The other car companies not so much, as the taxi market was just another side hustle to them. So they looked at what they had, their sturdy, spacious and practical cars, and decided to start up a parallel line of regular passenger cars. Pretty much the same thing, but slightly changed to appeal more to customers looking for a practical alternative for personal use. A taxi without a meter. This move coincided with another redesign for the regular taxi models. The Checker A8 was updated in 1959 to become the A9 and A10. And here is where the Checker cars received their final exterior redesign and are arguably the most well-known of all Checkers. If you think of a Checker cab, you think of this one. New this time were the addition of quad headlights and a slightly revised grille. And the redesign came with the expansion of the lineup that stretched beyond the taxi market. Passenger car versions were offered in two models. First, the Checker Superba, which you can identify by its slightly reworked grille, giving the car a more car-like appearance. But these are very rare. And second, the Checker Marathon. Now that's the model everybody knows. The Checker Marathon... Well, no, I can't do this. Hold on. You know, I figured it would be easier to just show you the real deal. So here is the real deal, a 1970 Checker Marathon. So let's talk about the design of this car, which is unusually tall and boxy as compared to many other American cars of its day. But then you have to remember that this car was designed in such a way to be as sturdy, practical and durable as possible. You have the dual headlights and the egg crate grille, which gives the front end a rather generic late 1950s American car design, but it is put on a body that is more decidedly, I would say, Russian or Soviet than really American. In fact, some Checkers were used in some movie productions where they would change the car a bit so that they could pass them on as actual Soviet cars. Another story is that the American embassy in Russia also ordered a bunch of Checker cabs because they could handle the rough Russian roads better than some contemporary Lincolns and Cadillacs. As we shall find out in a minute, Checker presented this car, and this is the taxi version, but I'm also talking about the passenger car version, as an absolute middle finger to everything that came out of Detroit. I mean, compare this car to the car right next to it, and the differences are all too obvious. The American car industry was all about longer, wider, and lower, resulting in cars that had dramatic year-to-year, styling changes and design changes, but were huge on the outside, but still fairly cramped on the inside. And then you have this, a car that was dependable, very easy to service, didn't really break down a lot, and lasted more than like 3 or 4 years and more than 150,000 miles. A car that was only changed when necessary and not changed for the sake of change. Step into the back of a Checker cab, and the magic becomes all too obvious. I mean, the legroom in this car is absolutely tremendous. Allow me to just sit back for a moment and talk to you through this little window here. Hello. If I sit back all the way like this, I can just stretch my legs and I will still not touch the wall in front of me. I think I do have more legroom than, let's say, a modern-day Mercedes S-Class or even like an extended wheelbase version. And this extra space also comes in handy because if it's not your legroom, you can easily take out this chair, fold it out, and this car becomes not a full-on 6-seater, but a full-on 8, and if you're lucky, 9-seater car. Because, okay, so the legroom is a bit snug with the extra seats, but it's not a given that you will always use the seats. And that brings me to another thing, because like I said, it is tall and boxy, but it really helps. Because the car is sitting on top of the frame, you also don't really have a drive shaft well, you do have a drive shaft, but it is below the floor, allowing for a completely flat floor. And also the tall roof really helps because you don't really have a cramped feeling in here at all. You can still wear a hat. And remember, this is a car with the same dimensions as any other American car, but it uses its space so efficiently that you can do so much more with the overall size of the car that you have. Prior to this review, I already received some documents from the museum. In fact, I have an archive full of checker stuff, which is really awesome, including this document right here, which is like a marketing briefing from some marketing agency in Chicago that was sent to Checker Motors Corporation in their headquarters in Kalamazoo in Michigan. And I just want to read it for a moment because it's really great. Just listen. Fins come, fins go. Hoods stretch out or shrink. Grills get glossier and gaudier. Fenders become higher and humpier. But there is still one American automobile manufacturer whose 1967 model, in this case 1967, looks just like the 1966 and the 65 and the 64, all the way back to the original. And each year, another small select group of motorists discover the virtues of this amazing car and join the continually increasing roster of Checker Marathon owners. But who are these owners? You might have heard the term Saab people or Volvo people, you know, physicians, engineers, architects, doctors, those type of people. Quirky people that like quirky cars because of their quirkiness. Well, when it comes to Checker, I think you could say checker people, which back in the day when it was sold, you know, in America in the 1960s, is probably the same type of group that also bought Volkswagen Beetles, like Volkswagen people, because the Beetle was very much like the Checker, very much an unpretentious car. And so Road and Track did a review on one of these passenger versions of the Checker in the 1960s, and also asked a local dealer in Southern California who were the people that bought these cars. And he said, well, the people that bought a Checker were a reflection of the car. Straight up, sensible, smart people that weren't convinced by any marketing bullshit and just, you know, judged the car on quantifiable statistics like interior space, how many miles it could go on a fuel tank, and how many miles it could totally do before it was, you know, worn out. And so he said it's the type of people that, well, you start to get an image when I say it's those people that buy a car like this outright, in cash, and not take out another auto loan. It's the type of people that bring their own pre-made sandwiches when they, you know, head outdoors. It's the type of people that get rich not by their earnings, but by their savings.
Trying to sell these taxi-based passenger cars turned out to be a great move. Throughout the 60s, Checker sales increased by as much as 70% to around 6,000 cars a year. Big numbers for Checker, but the established car industry wouldn't even think about starting up a new model line for such low production numbers. From here on out, Checker went wild. A station wagon version followed, an ambulance and hearse conversion followed, as well as a formal business limousine, which didn't really require a whole lot of effort to create. The interior space was already there to be easily converted into a luxurious limousine space. But the final chapter would be the Aerobus, which is a bit of a stretch if you ask me. The Checker Aerobus was specifically made for shuttling around the airport. These were limousines, but more like carry around lots of people limousines instead of luxury limousines. Checker wasn't the only one. Oldsmobile had a similar car called the Jetway 707.
What made the checker version unique, however, is that it wasn't a cut-and-paste job. The aero bus sat on top of one stretched X-frame, making the cars extremely sturdy and durable. Checker would go 2 lengths to satisfy airports with a 9 and 12 passenger version. And here comes my favorite trick, a comparison. The 9-passenger Aerobus had almost the exact same length as that of an early 70s Imperial LeBaron, which is 235 inches or just under 6 meters. Imagine buying a 6-meter long car and you had 2 choices: a massive 2-door coupe with a snug interior or an 8-passenger limousine for like half the price. I know what I would do. And so Checker is in this weird spot. It's a car maker but also a taxi operator. And they make cars specifically designed for the taxi market in mind, selling cars directly to their taxi division as well as to a few other operators. So essentially they're their own seller and buyer of cars. And when you compare this to the automotive industry giants, you see Checker's business model is the exact opposite of theirs. They mainly sell cars as taxis, with a few of them as regular passenger cars on the side, while the regular car companies mainly make all kinds of passenger cars and sell few of them on the side as a taxi. These cars are often the absolute base model of their largest cars, so-called stripper cars made for fleet markets like rental agencies and taxi operators. As mentioned before, if anything changes in the taxi market, Checker will definitely feel it, but the big three, it's just another day of doing business. And so that's what happened over the course of 20 years. In order to offer a car that was trouble-free, easy to maintain, and streamlined parts management, Checker deliberately chose to no longer update the A11 with new generations. And so over the course of 20 years, the design of the Checker cab stayed the same since 1958. Only if changes or updates were required by law, the cars were changed, like for instance the bigger safety bumpers by the mid-70s. Again, a major advantage is that if you're looking for a taxi as an operator, Checker has got you covered with a trusted, tried and true car that can take a beating. But also a car that is increasingly outdated and fuel thirsty. And this became a problem in the 1970s, when cars across the board had to be safer, pollute less, and above all, be more fuel efficient. And these were things a Checker weren't, but new low-cost full-sizers from the big three were. Checker gained more competition from fleet dumping practices from the big three on one side, changing taxi regulations from city councils on the other side, and increasing costs and need to improve to meet new emission, fuel consumption and safety laws on the other side, all the while trying to remain profitable. A first step was to cut some side hustles like the Aerobus, but in the meantime also look at ways to come up with a new generation of Checker cabs. By the late 70s, a partnership was formed with a former big boss from General Motors, and Volkswagen of America was also involved. The idea was to replace the big and bulky Checkers with stretched Volkswagen Golfs, or Rabbits as they were called in the US. Some work was carried out, but there were doubts about the strength and rigidity of the stretched Volkswagens. An untimely death of the former GM boss also didn't help. The idea was dropped. But the idea of a taxi based on a hatchback was picked up again. This time the upcoming X cars from General Motors, like the Chevrolet Citation, thoroughly new compact cars with a modern engine layout and front-wheel drive, could be interesting of becoming the next generation of Checkers. And so the plan was called the Galva 2. They initially start to stretch and customize a Chevrolet Citation to see what would work and what wouldn't. After doing that, Checker went on to create a custom body that would sit on top of the stretched Citation frame, that would match the interior space and practicality of the previous Checker cabs. The end result was something of a very large hatchback, almost like a modern-day crossover or SUV. The final design proposals were made around 1980, a time when the USA was in a recession, experienced 2 fuel crises, and the taxi market was shrinking. Checker was at the crossroads of a monumental decision. Are we going to continue our taxi business or give up forever? After concluding that the total weight of the Galva 2 concept car could be a challenge for the selection of fairly small engines from the Chevrolet Citation came with, along with the huge amounts of money that would be needed to start a new production line, it was ultimately deemed best not to continue with the development of a new Checker. Considering that the Citation turned out to be one of GM's worst cars ever made, this wasn't a bad decision at all. What's even more shockingly is that it was also decided to abandon the taxi market for good.
This meant that the existing production of the 20-year-old checker cab also came to a halt. The very last checker rolled off the assembly line in July 1982. The end of checker cabs marks the end of a legendary era, but the checker legacy was far from over. See, although they stopped producing cabs, through all these years they built up a lucrative side hustle as a bodybuilder for the big three. So, Checker as a carmaker stopped, but continued as a third-party automotive supplier. This continued until the financial crisis of 2008. And just because no cabs were built after 1982, this doesn't mean they instantly vanished off the streets. Far from it, in fact. The 1980s was another decade when checker cabs roamed the streets. Their presence slowly decreased over time, usually when they were retired after years of abuse, or really call it automotive rape, in the harsh urban jungle. When a checker was retired, it was replaced by cars such as the Chevrolet Caprice and later on the Ford Crown Victoria. The last checker to roam the streets was a cab by the name of Jenny. Jenny was a 1978 model and retired in 1999 after 21 years of service with almost 1 million miles on the clock. But even then, the checker lives on as a cultural icon. Entire generations grew up with the cars, in the bright yellow color and checker flag prints on the side. The cars were a common sight in movies from the 60s, 70s and 80s and sometimes played a leading role. Even today, as soon as a movie is set in the previous decade, chances are you'll see a checker. And when you do, always pay attention to the bumpers. Oftentimes, studios use checkers from the 70s in movie productions that are set in the 50s and the 60s. But these cars have the wrong bumpers to be period correct. Tell that to your date the next time you're going to the movies. She will want to kiss you, guaranteed. And that brings me to the last thing. When you think checker, you think about this model. This model has found its way in museums, private collections and movie sets, including Lauman's Toyota World. I want to thank Lauman for giving me the opportunity to get up close with this checker. Lauman is the official importer of Toyota and Lexus here in the Netherlands. But before that, they also imported Chryslers and, you guessed it, even checkers. For a few years, Lauman was the official Dutch importer of checker cabs, which roamed the streets in limited numbers until the 1990s, such as this one. But when you want to search for an older checker, good luck. The previous generations are almost non-existent. There is only one model lane known to exist, for example. And that makes it a magical paradox. It's interesting to see that these cars, which were found on every street corner in big cities, have now completely vanished, not only out of the streets, but also in the world of classic car collecting. After all, these were taxis, these weren't cars, but simply an instrument, a functional tool to get from one place to another, meant to be thrown away when it was worn out. Nothing more, nothing less.